Picture this: a palace veiled in gold, but echoing with whispers of betrayal. A woman walks its marble halls, her eyes burning brighter than the torches that line the throne room. They call her ambitious, dangerous, unfit to rule. Yet, behind those forbidden doors, she's plotting something far greater than revenge. She's planning to rewrite history itself. And when the crown finally trembles, the world will remember her name forever. Throughout history, empires have risen and fallen, often under the iron will of kings, conquerors, and tyrants. But every now and then, a woman steps out of the shadows and dares to challenge the divine order that crowns men as rulers. In ancient China, one such woman emerged, Wu Zetian. Born in 624 AD, she rose from a humble concubine to become the only female emperor in Chinese history. Her journey wasn't just about power. It was about survival in a world that saw her gender as weakness. She played a dangerous game, mastering the court's politics, silencing her enemies, and manipulating the most powerful men in the Tang dynasty. But to some, she wasn't a monster. She was a visionary who refused to let destiny define her. Her story isn't simply one of blood and betrayal, but of brilliance and endurance. This is the tale of the woman who challenged the throne and became a legend. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed dark history stories like this, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your feedback in the comments. The story begins in the heart of the Tang dynasty, a golden empire where silk shimmered like water under the sun, and the court's poets wrote verses that could make even the hardest warriors weep. But beneath this glittering perfection, power was a dangerous game, a theater of masks where loyalty was fragile and ambition deadly. Wu Zhao, a young girl born to a family of moderate standing, was never meant to play that game. Yet, from the moment she first entered the imperial palace as a concubine, she felt its weight pressing down on her. The hierarchy, the whispers, the slow suffocation of women whose names would never be remembered. She learned quickly that beauty opened doors, but intelligence kept them from closing. When Emperor Taizong noticed her sharp wit and her ability to read the mood of a room like poetry, she was elevated to his inner court. But Wu was not content with proximity. She wanted permanence. She wanted power that couldn't be taken away when the emperor's eyes wandered. Life in the Forbidden City was not a fairy tale. It was a cage lined with silk. Every smile from another concubine could hide a blade. Every banquet was a battlefield. Wu watched as rivals rose and fell overnight, some by accident, others by design. She studied their mistakes, memorized every rule unspoken yet absolute, and began to weave her own path quietly. When Emperor Taizong died, tradition dictated that his concubines who bore him no sons must retreat to a convent and live out their lives in spiritual exile. For most, it was a death of another kind, a slow fading into irrelevance. But not for Wu. Even as the cold wind carried her away from the palace, she refused to believe her story had ended. Destiny, she whispered to herself, was not something written. It was something rewritten. Years passed. The empire changed, as it always does, with the tides of blood and succession. Emperor Gaozong, Taizong's son, now sat upon the throne. He had once known Wu Zhao as his father's concubine, but time had a way of turning the forbidden into the fated. When fate brought them together again, it was as though a flame long buried under ash suddenly came alive. The court gasped. How could the son of the late emperor bring back his father's concubine? But Gaozong was entranced. Wu's intelligence had deepened into something magnetic, her grace refined by the fire of survival. She did not beg for his affection. She directed it. Slowly, with deliberate patience, she became his confidant, his advisor, and eventually his empress. Yet the path to that crown was drenched in whispers of poison, betrayal, and blood. Rivals who mocked her rise found themselves stripped of titles or mysteriously gone. To her enemies, she was the serpent of the court. To her allies, the embodiment of divine strength. And to Gaozong, she was the woman he could not rule without. Or perhaps the one who ruled him entirely. But here's the chilling part. Wu Zhao's power did not come from love alone. She understood that the throne was not protected by affection, but by fear. Once she became empress, her transformation was complete. She built alliances not through kindness, but through necessity. Ministers who doubted her quickly learned that her smile could vanish faster than a shadow in sunlight. The court chroniclers would later write that she used seduction as a weapon, manipulation as her language. But what they rarely admitted was that she used intellect as her sword. She could quote philosophy better than most scholars, and when men tried to outwit her, she disarmed them with logic, not rage. Still, every step forward came with a price. When Gaozong's health began to fail, whispers claimed she hastened it, that she poisoned him to seize full control. History may never prove it. But what's undeniable is this. When he died, it was Wu Zetian, not any prince, who held the empire's reins. Imagine the scene. The dragon throne, once reserved for men ordained by heaven, now guarded by a woman. Ministers trembled at the sight. Foreign envoys bowed lower than they ever had before, uncertain whether they were greeting a ruler or defying the natural order itself. Wu Zetian declared herself not just Empress Dowager, but Emperor. The poor, son of heaven in her own right, the very title was rewritten to fit her reign. She founded a new dynasty, the Zhou, and ruled with a hand both visionary and ruthless. Her critics called her a usurper. Her supporters saw a savior who restored stability after years of corruption. She appointed scholars by merit rather than birth, opened the gates of government to talent regardless of gender, and expanded the empire's influence through diplomacy and reform. Yet, her brilliance came with a darkness that frightened even her allies. Dissent was silenced brutally. Those who plotted against her, or seemed to, disappeared in the night, their families often following. The palace was said to echo with the cries of ghosts. Still, the people saw roads built, harvests strengthened, and justice delivered swiftly, if coldly. To the poor, she was the ruler who listened. To the elite, the storm they couldn't stop. Even now, centuries later, historians debate whether she was a tyrant or a genius ahead of her time. But perhaps the truth is both. Power does not come clean, especially when seized by someone the world insists should not have it. Wu Zetian was both the architect and the prisoner of her own empire. Behind every decree lay a question. How far must one go to be remembered? She ruled for decades, her hand steady as she wrote edicts that shaped China's destiny. Yet at night, they say she would walk alone in the hall of heavenly light, staring at the throne she had conquered, whispering to the stars that once guided her. Did she ever wonder if the crown had been worth the cost? We may never know. But one thing is certain, she defied every rule carved into the bones of her world, and in doing so, became more than a ruler. She became a myth made flesh. The empire she built shimmered like gold under the morning sun, but the closer one looked, the more cracks appeared beneath the surface. Power, after all, has a hunger that never sleeps. Wu Zetian ruled from the towering palace of Luoyang, surrounded by painted screens and the scent of incense that tried, but failed, to mask the stench of fear. Every official who entered her court knew that one wrong word could seal their fate. She had eyes everywhere. Eunuchs loyal only to her, informants hidden in monasteries, and even servants trained to notice the tremor in a minister's hands. The empire became an organism with her as its living heart, pumping both justice and terror through its veins. But what drove her wasn't vanity. It was the memory of a world that once told her she was nothing. Each decree, each trial, each act of mercy or wrath was her defiant answer to centuries of silence. Still, even an emperor cannot escape the weight of their crown. Beneath the jade ornaments and silk robes, Wu remained a woman who had once been told she would die forgotten. That wound, though invisible, never healed. Imagine her sitting alone at night, surrounded by scrolls of philosophy and reports of rebellion. The candlelight flickered across her face, half illuminated, half shadowed, like a mirror of her legacy itself. She had expanded education for women, restored ancient rituals, and stabilized the economy. Yet each achievement was haunted by the price of its preservation. Dissent was like a disease that demanded constant amputation. Generals who questioned her were executed. Courtiers who spoke too boldly vanished without a trace. Even her own sons were not immune to suspicion. Some she exiled, others she allegedly poisoned. History paints her as cruel, and perhaps she was. But cruelty was her currency in a world that valued obedience over truth. Better to be feared than forgotten, she once told her advisors, her voice cold as porcelain. They nodded, not because they agreed, but because they wanted to keep breathing. Outside the palace walls, people whispered her name in reverence and in terror, not realizing that both were forms of worship. The court poets dared not immortalize her deeds. In their verses, fearing the line between praise and blasphemy had grown too thin. But there was one monk, a scholar named Fa Yuan, who saw something divine in her defiance. "She is not a woman," he wrote, "but the spirit of the dragon reborn in mortal form." Wu Zetian rewarded him with gold and exile. For even admiration, when too bold, could be dangerous. She preferred silence over flattery, control over chaos. Still, she was not blind to her reputation. The imperial records were her greatest obsession. She personally reviewed the chronicles that would one day define her reign. When she found words that cast her in shadow, she erased them. When she saw loyalty unrecorded, she added it herself. It was not vanity, it was survival through narrative. She understood that history was written by those who held the brush, not by those who bled beneath it. And she held that brush firmly. Yet even as she shaped her empire and her legend, the walls began to whisper again. Age softened her face, but sharpened her paranoia. Ministers plotted her downfall. Secret societies rose under banners of moral restoration, and the ghosts of the past returned in the form of rumors. They said the spirits of those she had silenced wandered the palace halls. Servants claimed to hear weeping in the night, the echo of forgotten names. Wu ignored them at first, but when the emperor's ancestral tablets began to crack, when the temple fires flickered without wind, she began to wonder if heaven itself was sending a message. To the people, she was still the emperor of heaven's mandate, but deep inside, she felt the weight of that divine burden slipping. Her health faltered. Her voice weakened. Yet she refused to let go. "Heaven chose me," she whispered to her reflection one night, "and heaven will not take me without a fight." But power, like flame, consumes everything it touches, even its bearer. Imagine standing beside her on a winter morning as she walked through the imperial gardens. Trees bare, ponds frozen, the silence of age all around her. Once, those gardens had been filled with laughter and music, with ministers vying for her attention and generals pledging loyalty. Now they were ghostly. The cranes she once released as symbols of peace no longer returned. The empire stretched, vast and beautiful beyond the palace gates, but its heart was weary. Rebellion simmered at the edges, and her once loyal guards began to look away when her carriage passed. Still, Wu Zetian's eyes burned with the same defiance she had carried. From her youth, she summoned her ministers one last time and spoke of renewal, of legacy, of the need for strength even when the body fails. They nodded again, this time not out of fear, but awe. They were witnessing the end of something extraordinary. The woman who had rewritten destiny now faced the only adversary she could not conquer: time. But here's the haunting truth. Even as her dynasty faltered, her mind remained sharp. She called for the great scholars of her age and ordered a final decree: that records of her reign be preserved, not erased. "Let them judge me," she said, her voice thin but unbroken. "Let them curse me if they must, but let them remember me." It was a command born not of pride, but of defiance. For centuries, women had been erased from history, their achievements credited to men, their ambitions condemned as sin. Wu Zetian refused that fate, and in her final days, she did something even her fiercest enemies could not predict. She abdicated, not in surrender, but in strategy. She restored the Tang dynasty, naming her son as emperor, and retreated to her chambers in quiet dignity. But history remembers what happened next in fragments. A faint rumor, a poetic myth. They say that on the night before her death, she asked to see the stars. Servants opened the great roof of her chamber, and as the moonlight touched her face, she whispered a single line: "The throne was never mine. It was borrowed from eternity." Her death was peaceful, but the silence that followed was not. The court moved swiftly to erase her symbols, destroy her temples, and restore the patriarchal order she had shattered. Yet the people did not forget. Pilgrims left offerings at her tomb. Poets, in secret, wrote of her as the phoenix who ruled the dragons. Even centuries later, during the Song and Ming dynasties, scholars debated her legacy: villain or visionary, sinner or saint. The answer changed with the times, reflecting less about her and more about those who judged her. And today, as we look back across the distance of history, it's impossible not to feel a quiet awe. Because Wu Zetian's story is not just about one woman's rise to power. It's about the human hunger to be seen, to be remembered, to claim a voice in a world that constantly tries to silence it. Her empire may have faded, her temples may have turned to dust, but her defiance still echoes in every woman who refuses to accept the limits the world imposes. After her death, the empire she once commanded tried to bury her memory under layers of revision and silence. But legends have a way of outliving those who fear them. Her tomb at Qianling, carved deep into the hills of Shanxi, became a riddle for generations, guarded by twin stone lions, sealed by a massive unmarked stele. No inscription, no name, just a blank slab. as if daring history to fill in the yoke. Silence. It was the final irony of Wu Zetian's life. The woman who controlled every word written about her left her own epitaph unwritten. Some say it was humility. Others claim it was vengeance. A silent message to the men who tried to define her. You cannot write me. That blank stone became a mirror, reflecting the eyes of every generation that looked upon it, forcing them to ask not who she was, but what she represented. Power, ambition, intellect, defiance. Or perhaps the simple truth that greatness rarely fits the mold society builds for it. The centuries rolled on, dynasties rose and fell, but the myth of Wu Zetian refused to die. She became the forbidden story whispered among scholars and sung by wandering storytellers in hidden tea houses. Mothers warned their daughters about her, and yet, secretly, they admired her. For some, she was the serpent who brought chaos to order. For others, the flame that illuminated a path no woman before her had dared to walk. Imagine being a young girl in the Song dynasty, hearing for the first time that once a woman ruled China, not as a consort or regent, but as emperor. That single thought could ignite a dream. It wasn't just about politics, it was about possibility. Wu Zetian's reign became less a historical fact and more a symbol, a rebellion against the silence imposed by tradition. And though centuries of male historians tried to twist her story into a cautionary tale, her defiance survived in the very act of their obsession. For every word written to condemn her, another was born to defend her. Even now, in the modern age, her shadow stretches across time. Scholars study her policies with admiration. Feminists see her as the first woman who truly ruled an empire on her own terms. Psychologists dissect her decisions, debating whether she was shaped more by trauma or ambition. Yet the truth may lie somewhere deeper, in that quiet, unspoken place between survival and destiny. Because Wu Zetian's life wasn't just a story of a woman fighting men, it was a story of a human fighting the invisible chains of expectation. Think about it. In a society that defined virtue as obedience, she dared to define it as power. In a culture that worshipped male authority, she turned the divine mandate into her own reflection. Was she ruthless? Yes. Was she manipulative? Undoubtedly. But can we condemn her for using the only weapons the world allowed her? Or was her sin simply refusing to stay small? There's something hauntingly familiar about that question, even today. Look around. The stage has changed, but the script remains eerily similar. In boardrooms, in politics, in art and science, women who rise too high are still called ambitious, calculating, or unnatural. The language of fear hasn't evolved as much as we'd like to believe. Wu Zetian's story is not ancient history. It's a mirror. It reflects the discomfort society feels when confronted by female power that doesn't apologize. And maybe that's why her legacy endures, because every generation rediscovers her through its own struggles. In her, they see both the danger and the necessity of challenging the throne, whatever form that throne may take. Imagine her spirit walking through modern Beijing, through skyscrapers that pierce the clouds she once ruled beneath. Would she recognize the world she helped shape? Or would she smile at how much of her defiance still breathes within it? But history, as always, is not kind to its rebels. The official chronicles of the Tang dynasty reduced her to caricature, a temptress, a murderer, a power-hungry witch. They wrote of her alleged crimes with relish, but glossed over her reforms, her education policies, her support of Buddhism. and her patronage of literature. It's easier to vilify what threatens comfort. Yet fragments of truth survived in unexpected places, in temple carvings, in fragments of poetry, in the quiet records of those who dared to admire her. One ancient verse, found centuries later, reads, "She ruled with the calm of the moon and the fury of the storm. In her eyes, heaven saw its own reflection." It's a line that transcends gender, power, and time. And perhaps that's the closest anyone has come to capturing her essence. For Wu Zetian was not trying to be a man. She was trying to be more than human, to embody a balance the world had forgotten. Toward the end of her life, as illness overtook her, she reportedly told her attendants, "I have done what none dared. Let them speak." Those words, simple yet thunderous, became her final decree. She knew that the stories written after her death would not be kind. She knew they would twist her into a monster to make sense of their fear. But she also knew something they didn't, that legends don't need permission to live. They just need truth to be whispered enough times to survive. And so, generation after generation, the whispers grew. Her image changed with each retelling, sometimes a tyrant, sometimes a saint, but always unforgettable. Perhaps that's what immortality really is, not divine favor or eternal life, but the refusal to be erased. Today, historians still debate whether she deserves admiration or condemnation. But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the real lesson of Wu Zetian isn't about morality at all. It's about willpower. The will to rise when told you cannot. The will to lead when the world insists you should follow. The will to carve your own destiny in stone, even if that stone remains unmarked. When we talk about the woman who challenged the throne, we aren't just talking about a figure from the Tang dynasty. We're talking about every person who has dared to defy the system built to contain them. Her story reminds us that power, in any age, demands sacrifice. But it also shows that sometimes that sacrifice births something larger than life. A legend, a warning, and an inspiration all at once. So picture it one last time. The silent tomb under the gray sky. The blank stele catching the morning. Light and the wind whispering through the valley where her empire once breathed. Somewhere beneath layers of earth and centuries of dust lies the woman who refused to vanish. No inscription marks her name, but she doesn't need one. Her name lives wherever courage meets defiance. Her story breathes wherever someone refuses to kneel. And as history continues its endless march, the echoes of her voice still linger, soft but unyielding, like a heartbeat carved in stone. The woman who challenged the throne did not just become a legend. She became the question history can never stop asking. What if power had no gender? Wu Zetian's story ends not with defeat, but with remembrance. Centuries later, her name still stands as a symbol of courage that refused to bow to tradition. She lived in an age that told her to be silent, yet her voice became the echo of an empire. Her reign reminds us that power is not defined by gender, but by vision, and by the strength to pursue it when the world calls you unworthy. Whether you see her as a tyrant or a trailblazer, one truth remains undeniable. She changed history simply by daring to exist on her own terms. So, the next time you stand before an obstacle that feels impossible, remember the woman who faced an empire and won. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell icon, like the video, and tell us in the comments what type of stories you'd like to see. Your support helps us keep bringing forgotten legends like this one back to life. One voice, one truth, one untold story at a time.